Welcome to the Student Ministry Podcast. This is episode 75 of the Student Ministry Podcast. My name is Steve Cullen, and I'm so excited for you to be here today. Today, I'm going to be talking with Dr. Josh Packard. Josh is the Executive Director of Springtide Research Institute. Springtide has a desire to listen and attend to the lives of young people that are ages 13 to 25. So a lot of the teenagers and young people that we work with on a regular basis, they do a lot of research that really benefits us. And they've recently released the State of Religion and Young People for 2021, and they've titled it Navigating Uncertainty. And this is a compilation of all their research that they have taken with thousands of teenagers, young people, 13 through 25, across the country, and just really compiled this into a book. And you can get that as a physical copy or a digital copy. The digital copy is free. You can find that link in our show notes. And if you'd like to purchase the physical copy, you can do so. Also, link in our show notes. But if you want a chance at winning a free copy of the physical version, all you need to do is go to the link in our show notes or just head over to bit.ly/springtidebook. That's bit.ly/springtidebook. And you'll get a chance to win that physical copy. We're going to be drawing the winner at the end of January 2022. So you got a little time if you're listening to this right as it comes out. Now, there's a lot of great stuff in that book, a lot about navigating uncertainty of young people today. You and I know that that's just the world they live in. And it's going to be really important for us to unpack all the stuff that Josh and his team found out through all their research. But before we do that, I want to just quickly thank you so much for being here, for listening to the podcast. If you haven't done so yet, hit that subscribe button on whatever podcast app or service you listen to it. That way you get every episode whenever it drops. Also, be sure to share this. And if you're allowed to leave a review on whatever podcast app or service you use, please do that. That would be a huge benefit to us. And before we move on, we do need to thank the sponsors of this episode of the Student Ministry Podcast. Our first sponsor is G-Shades. It's a youth ministry curriculum and teaching strategy focused on helping students see every life situation through the lens of the gospel. There's several options to fit everyone with 3 plans to choose from. This curriculum gives you the resources that you need to do what you do better. Do you need message outlines, a discussion guide, and a game? That's just $16 a month. If you're looking for a higher production value, including bumper videos, Instagram devotionals, and parent guides, that's $25 a month. And do you want an affordable youth ministry video curriculum that can help you increase your online reach during this pandemic? G-Shades has you covered for $36 a month. You will not find a better youth ministry video curriculum at that price point anywhere. G-Shades really sets itself apart by helping students see the gospel applies to every life situation that is out there. And if you want to find out more about Mike Haynes, the founder of G-Shades, you can check out episodes 32 and 55 of the Student Ministry Podcast. So go ahead and head over to gshades.org to download Season 3 of G-Shades Youth Ministry Curriculum. And be sure to use the promo code TSMPOD for the Student Ministry Podcast at checkout to get an extra 10% off. gshades.org and use the promo code TSMPOD. G-Shades, seeing life through the lens of the gospel. Also sponsoring this episode is Men Hub Youth, which was actually developed by a fellow student pastor to help people like you and me. Men Hub Youth helps you store and track student, staff, and parent info, as well as your attendance for all of your events. There are a lot of great features, but today I want to talk to you about event notes. After an event is over, it's a great time to collect info about the event. Ministry moments allow you to log what happened with students, but event notes are a great place to collect the feedback about the event itself. Then, as you plan for your future events, you can look back at previous notes to see what worked out and what you might want to improve on for the next event. On its own, the app is only $5 on iOS and Android, and you can use it forever on that one device without ever having to pay again. But if you want to synchronize your database across multiple devices or with your leaders, you can sign up for the Men Hub Sync service and support the Student Ministry Podcast by visiting menhubsync.com/SMP. That's MINHUB sync.com/SMP for Student Ministry Podcast. You can find the links for both G-Shades and MinHub in the podcast show notes. Thanks so much to G-Shades and MinHub for sponsoring this episode of the Student Ministry Podcast. All right, now it's time to get into this very important conversation with Dr. Josh Packard. Well, hey, Josh, thanks so much for being on the podcast today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
So before we get into any of the research and reports that you guys have been putting out, which is so awesome, I'd love to just get to know you a little bit more. So if you could just share a little of your story and how you got to the point where you are today.
Sure, happy to do that. I think in some ways it's really important. I tell it's good to know a little who you're talking to, so you can know what parts to pay attention to and which parts to disregard and put away. I come at this role as the executive director of Springtide from a career out of higher ed. So I have a PhD in sociology from Vanderbilt, and then spent about 15 years as a professor. All through that time, it was really, as much as I really admire what my colleagues do who, publish things, really smart things for each other to read, I was always really interested in taking that stuff and translating it and getting it outside of the academy for my students, for practitioners, for anybody who could listen. And my specialty all along was organizations and religion. So I wrote a book some years ago called Church Refugees, and started really thinking about, what are some of the ways that we could help religious institutions adapt to meet the changing needs of these new generations. And that led to a series of conversations that ultimately I was invited to help dream and think about what Springtide would be, and then was asked to serve as the first executive director. So I left my role as a professor in May of this year and came on to Springtide full time. Springtide's now been around for a couple of years. We had the great timing to launch our first research study called Belonging in March of 2020.
Right, when
what a wonderful time
to belong and connect.
Well, yeah. But, it was like weeks, and we were trying to launch a whole new research firm to the public, and the only thing anybody's talking about is the pandemic. But that's fine. Right. It's been a really great couple of years and to get us started here. And the big thing that we do, and a lot of what I think we're probably going to end up talking about today, is every fall we put out the State of Religion and Young People, and it's a summation of about 10,000 nationally representative surveys that we do with young people, and a bunch of interviews and other qualitative data to really help us understand how young people are thinking about faith and religion and spirituality, how they're accessing the transcendent or the divine, how it intersects with their daily lives. And these are important questions because, as much as individual institutions might understand their own communities, we've got like 41, 42% of young people claiming no religious affiliation whatsoever. So, there's a whole lot of young people out there that are just not picked up by those institutions. So that's a big part of what Springtide, lives to do.
Cool. And I'm assuming you guys are finding a lot of, has COVID drastically affected those research, the stuff you're finding right now, or are you still trying to figure out how it's affecting it?
Well, certainly, COVID is the defining feature of, this generation's life. It will all, forever be the thing that marks Gen Z. But it's had in terms of impacts, it's sort of a mixed bag. So, especially when it comes to religion, about a quarter of young people say that they're more religious than they were before the pandemic. About a quarter say they're less, and about half say it's the same. So, pretty even distribution there. And, more than anything, I think what we've seen is a real acceleration of trends that were already in place long before COVID. So it's not so much that 2021 and 2022 are going to look, differently than we could have ever imagined. It's that, the 2021 looks sort of more like what I think most people would have thought that 2025 would have looked like, or 2026. It's just that institutional distrust and disconnection and the loneliness and isolation trends. All of those picked up a whole lot of steam over the last 18 months or so.
Yeah. It's one of the classes that I wasn't sure about that I took in college was sociology, and it was kind of of course I had to take it, and I was like, I don't really know if I'm going to enjoy this at all. But the next thing I knew, I was loving every minute of it. And that's kind of like the thoughts that's been in my head this entire pandemic is, man, what's the sociological impacts that we're going to see both within the church and our community as a whole? Like, what's going to stick, what's going to change. And so it is fascinating. And it's awesome to see that you guys are digging into that, specifically with young people and seeing the impacts on that and sharing that with us. We're very grateful for that.
Yeah, we're happy to do it. I tell people all the time, I said, sociology, if you remember, is that class you took in college that you really liked, but you couldn't figure out how to make a career out of it. So you went and majored in something more practical.
There you go.
Yeah, we find that a lot.
Yeah. So this year's report specifically focuses on uncertainty about the future, which you guys say, like, that's really the cause of a lot of anxiety, which is really so much in our world today. Is there anything else that people should know about this report, just in general, before we start digging into the specifics or any of the findings, anything in general?
Well, just to remind people, this is a study that this is a summation of everything that we've learned this year, and a part of something that we put out every fall. So last year was all about the right relational frameworks to engage young people. And this is about uncertainty, because uncertainty not only is that the hallmark of youth generally going back, decades or more, but you're right. Like, that has been the thing that we keep hearing over and over as we talk to young people in the last year. How would you describe this year? What's going on in your life right now? Well, uncertainty became, not only is it a general thing about being young, but it's very specific to this moment as well.
Yeah. So there's so much in this report. I would encourage people to actually go grab a free digital copy, or if you want to buy the book version as well. We'll have all those links in the show notes. But there was just a few things that I wanted to talk about today, and then we can kind of dig into anything else that you think would be beneficial to our listeners. But there's a few things that stood out to me, and one of them was that you guys found that young people, like, in all their uncertainty, that they're not turning to religion necessarily, but they are still being religious. So, like, not religion in a traditional sense. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, well, so they're not turning to religious institutions. And I think that's a really important distinction, because they are often turning to, religious thoughts, religious ideas, religious questions to help them make sense of uncertainty. But they're still asking the same kinds of timeless questions that young people have always asked and have always cared about. What should I do with my life? How do I make sense of what's going on right now in this moment? How should I live? How should I treat other people? It's that what has happened, in the United States over the last 50 years is that we've largely conflated religious institutions with those questions to say, oh, well, the place where you ask and answer those questions is inside of religious institutions. It's at a church on a Sunday morning, or at a campus ministry event, or at a synagogue on a Friday night or something. I mean, what young people are doing largely now is, sort of decoupling those things. That those conversations, of course, can happen in those institutional spaces, but no longer are those institutional spaces the sort of sole domain where those conversations are playing out, which I think is really important. So, when we see those declining attendance numbers, it means that we shouldn't take those as indicators that young people don't care about these questions, or that they're not interested in this conversation. And it's the same for affiliation. Just because we have fewer young people checking the box that says I'm Christian Catholic or Christian Protestant or Muslim or whatever, it doesn't mean that they're not interested in what are essentially religious questions, even if they're not being funneled through those institutional means as much anymore.
That's really good. Because I was actually just talking to another youth pastor yesterday, and I was telling him how I'm actually in the process of wrestling with that I feel like a lot of teenagers are still interested in that, like you said, but it doesn't mean our church doors are just flying open every Sunday with them flooding into a church, but they are seeking those answers. They're still interested in it. We just can't. The traditional ways of us telling them about it are maybe long, behind us. We have to think about it in a different way to engage them. So it might
even be that whole model is flipped, that it used to be like, let's get them indoors so we can have this conversation. And now I think you could almost argue that it's completely the opposite, which is let's have that conversation. And then, maybe at the end of it, they'll walk through the door, but it's not that it is not going to be the first move for most young people.
Yeah. Yeah. And I thought about, like, I know Andy Stanley have had the house model. And for a lot of times, like into a church, like that Sunday morning worship experience has been the front door. Well, it's not necessarily the front door anymore. It might be the coffee shop conversation, or it might be the, around a dinner table or whatever. It might be the first entry into a church kind of, or a religious kind of conversation, way before they even give, a church or a synagogue or whatever a chance.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So kind of along with that, you guys also found that there's this unbundling, like you talked about with faith, with belief and identity and community and practices. Could you please explain that? You guys go into depth in the research and everything too, but where does that, I guess, come together? How are they actually unbundling their faith with these like key elements of life?
Yeah, so this is sort of like right into the meat of the study. But the ramification. Obviously, if you spend a whole generation heightened by a pandemic of decoupling those conversations from these traditional institutions, well, there's important ramifications for that. And what we wanted to do was really to understand then. What does that mean for young people? What, if they're still interested in these questions, if they're still having these conversations, but they're not doing it in religious institutions or with religious guides, what does that ultimately look like? And what we ended up calling it is faith unbundled. And there are some, hallmarks to that. Curiosity, flexibility, connection, wholeness, are these four sort of elements that make up faith unbundled. But it really means, like, on the flexibility front, for example, like, what does it mean to unbundle like practice? Well, like ritual from a faith. What means that, like, they're just not going to take this whole bound set of rituals, that they're going to be flexible about them and how they employ them and ultimately what they do with it. What is it they're trading in? Is it, when you unbundle faith from community, it looks like connection. So they're still very much interested, in fact, only interested in having these conversations and experiences with those around them. But the idea of embedding themselves into a community that they would sort of submit to and, sort of let, have guidance over their life, like, that's not necessarily a thing that they're going to sign up for. They're much more interested in being connected to a lot of different expressions so they can understand the process, and on and on.
Yeah.
And in some ways, like, this is really, I think, terrifying, because you get young people saying, like, oh, we're picking up pieces of different religious systems, some of which, even the scholar in me is like, well, those are intact religious traditions that go back thousands of years. You should probably be, experiencing or addressing them as a whole system, right? You shouldn't be like picking commandments. Like, you should understand where they all came from and why, and the historical context around that, etc. But then, the other part of me kicks in, which is to remember that our research comes from 13 to 25-year-olds, and if uncertainty is one of the hallmarks of youth, then certainly change and exploration are other hallmarks. And I think what we've got here is not much a static picture for what young people's faith lives are, as much as what with Faith Unbundled, what we've got is a process for how young people are experiencing and exploring faith. And that is a much different kind of thing. And that sort of tells us, like, okay, just because they are this at 14, that is probably not the faith that they're going to have at 24, 34. I mean, my faith at 43 is not the faith that I had at 13. I doubt many people's are. And so when I remember that, I start to ease up a little bit, and I relax. I'm like, okay, these are just the pillars around which we should be having these conversations with young people about. We should let them be curious. We should, be flexible where we can be flexible. We should foster connections and make sure that they can show up with all of their identities and be whole in these conversations, not feel like they have to hide parts of who they are just to engage in a conversation or exploration about, your faith or background or any system.
Yeah. That makes so much sense. And I think even on a simple idea, like, we see that a lot with the students that we would just call, like, they have a serious case of FOMO. They don't want to commit because there might be something else that comes along. And so, like, I'm going to take a little bit of this and a little bit of that because, like, I want to experience it all. And in this world of information right at our fingertips, like, they can experience pretty much as they want to, and research
Sure.
as much as they want to. Yeah. And so it definitely makes sense that would come from that as well. And one other thing that I wanted to get into, which really kind of, I think, from a youth pastor standpoint, it was really enlightening and kind of upsetting, I guess, as us as a whole. It seems like you guys found that this generation really needs for us to support them, and rather than fix and solve their uncertainty. However, your data also said that there was evidence that religious leaders have not been the ones reaching out to support the young people, and they don't feel necessarily comfortable reaching out to religious leaders. So it's vice versa, like both sides, rather they're going to friends and family instead. So can you further explain that, and like what maybe some implications that has for us as youth workers?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so the data that you're referring to specifically, about half of young people say that they wouldn't even know how to access a religious community, even if they wanted to. And so, when they are feeling uncertain or having stressful moments or events and traumatic events in their lives, 16% of them say that they turn to a religious community. That's the same percentage that say that they turn to nobody. It's just not, that is not a great place to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's not a great place to be for young people. I mean, religious leaders, trusted religious leaders have a lot of really important things to offer for young people. And I think young people sense that and know it. That they just, but in some ways they just don't know, they don't have a skill set. Sometimes things are common language even to you and me are just not common language for a generation that is increasingly being raised, outside of religious structures and institutions. And so, asking somebody to come, I think of a term that was so like commonplace in my youth, the word narthex, which is just not, I can't imagine any 16-year-old knows what a narthex is anymore, which is very much like a part of my parlance when I was growing up. Or even a sanctuary. Last time I taught the sociology of religion, and we went on field trips a couple of years ago now. It was like 3/4 of my class that had never been. We went to a Catholic church, a Protestant church, and a synagogue. I never expect that anybody's been in 3 of them, but this time it was like 3/4 of the class that hadn't been in any house of worship, and that means that there's just a whole kind of not just literal vocabulary, but there's a physical vocabulary that they don't know how to move through the space. It's all intimidating. I mean, imagine showing up to someplace that you just completely fundamentally don't understand. You're not likely to do it. On the other side of that, though, through the whole pandemic, what we saw is about, we asked young people at the end of the 1 year into the pandemic, who, if anybody outside of your home has reached out to you to check on you? And only 10% of them said that a religious leader, a faith leader, had reached out to them during the last year. And those are, so there's a pretty big disconnect there. It's not one that's built on personal failure. I've never met a youth director in my entire life who wasn't trying hard. I've never met a youth director who didn't care enough, or a pastor or a campus minister or a rabbi or what. I mean, all the religious leaders I meet are, by and large, like they're trying really hard to do the work. I think what that speaks to is, how our systems are arranged and how mismatched they are for this current moment. So why did only 10% of young people have a religious or faith leader reach out to them? Well, we don't have systems in place to do relationships at scale very well. We have systems in place largely to do program-driven youth ministry at scale really well. But those systems rely on the assumption of high institutional trust, that families will bring their kids to this physical place. And when that either doesn't exist, which is the world that we live in, or isn't accessible, like a pandemic, well, we find that we just aren't very good at knowing what else to do yet. And that's not because people aren't smart. It's just because they haven't, program-driven youth ministry has like 50 or more years of innovation, and entrepreneurship and training and skill building and professionalization behind it. We really just need to bring that same dedication and innovation to relationships that we've been bringing to programs. So I think that number is, really just sort of reflective of the systems that we live and work in right now. But it is a call to action. I mean, it really is that is the future. This need for relationships over programs is not going away for this generation anytime soon.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I was just talking to a youth pastor there today. It's very much in a similar place. It's like, I feel like what this pandemic has actually raised is some things that we maybe knew all along, but that it does need a switch from being program, heavy to relationship focused, and making that change after 50 or so years in this tradition that we've just built upon and built upon. We know how to do that. It requires us to maybe think outside the box and okay, maybe this isn't the way it should be done. And that's tough sometimes.
It's really hard. It's so hard, I think, because not only is it what you know how to do, and you're good at executing it, it takes a recognition that, the most innovative and forward-thinking people are going to say, oh, this isn't completely broken yet, and yet it's time for a change. And so it's going to require leaving things because right now, those program models are still sort of hanging on. It's not like you do stuff and have nobody show up. Still some people are showing up. And so,
right.
But that's what it's going to have to be, because just as much as I've never met a youth director who wasn't trying hard enough, I also have very, very few youth ministries that are swimming or awash in resources, so pivoting towards relationships is going to mean giving up something else. You just don't have the time to do both, or the resources to do both. And that's I know that's what the data say, and so I can be very convicted in saying this is what the data are showing, and also I recognize how difficult it will be to execute.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, but that's definitely something to think about and be praying about as well. So what other insights that from the research, things that we didn't talk about already, what can other youth pastors that are listening, what are some ways that they can gain from what you guys have found out so far? Any other just general things that kind of popped out to you that we need to be paying attention to?
Well, there's a couple of things. One is to remember, that this is the most diverse generation that's ever existed in the history of the world, anywhere, period. And that can be a strange thing to really understand in terms of the ramifications, because functionally in our day-to-day lives, in the physical worlds that we inhabit in this country, they're still pretty segregated, especially along race and class lines. So, our schools and the neighborhoods that we live in, the places that we worship, those tend to still be pretty homogenous along race and class. But their online lives are not homogenous at all. They're certainly not these egalitarian, Edens or anything. I don't mean to paint that picture. They're far more diverse than what most of us who are charged with connecting with young people grew up with in any way. I mean, we just, there's no model for that. And what that means is that they not only experience diversity on a far more regular way than we ever would have, but that diversity rises to the top for them. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mean, these are not the same things, and young people certainly understand that are not satisfied with diversity alone. I'm just sort of using that as a catch-all phrase right now. But that it rises as a paramount value. So when we talk about wholeness that I mentioned earlier as part of this faith unbundled, I mean, that becomes one of these really key litmus tests. If they can't show up and be whole, and their friends can't show up and feel whole in these spaces, they might come for a little while, to the conversation, just long enough to understand who you are and what you're about, but they won't stay. They will not stay. And so, that doesn't mean that you have to accommodate every single thing that they ever want to be, because young people, of course, can't, but you do have to accommodate that exploration. You have to, if you're going to engage them over a long haul, you're going to have to show that you are committed to being uncomfortable in spaces with them, partially as they explore, but also as they challenge you around issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so these are, when they're thinking about religion and religious questions, it starts from this notion of equality. And if we can't engage on those terms, then I would say you're probably behind the 8 ball to start. So that rise. I mean, that's the first of things I would say are really important takeaways from just understanding Gen Z in general.
Cool. Yeah, that's so good. Yeah. What else was there?
Yeah, the second one is that they are really, really interested in thinking about their religious questions, their faith questions, spiritual questions as part of a larger conversation that it is. They are not trying to find sort of static answers at this moment that like as you referred to earlier, like a problem to be fixed. They don't think about their faith as a problem to be fixed. I know a lot of religious leaders will see that 41 or so % of young people who are unaffiliated as a problem to be solved.
Yeah.
They do not experience it that way, right? They see it as a thing to be explored. And so we should just like they think about everything else in their lives, by the way. I mean, this should come as no surprise. We understand that, like, their artistic selves are things to be explored. Their relational selves, with their friends and with, people that they are romantically involved with, like, these are things to be explored in their faith lives too. That changes, I think, the dynamic for what we do for what religious leaders do. Instead of trying to, convince young people to come, to make a claim one way or the other, to say, like, yes, this is the faith that I belong to, and forevermore and forevermore. I think it's more realistic to think about, can we engage them in a conversation that is ongoing and unfolding over the course of a decade? It's a much different stance. But you can still do the first part. Like, you can still ask them to get confirmed and get baptized and make a statement of faith and all these things. You're fooling yourself, I think, if that happens, and then you sort of like, sort of like, okay, dust off your hands, like, you can go to bed tonight because we know that we got one more.
Yeah.
Check the box. You might go to sleep at night thinking that you won something, but what this generation keeps telling us in so many ways is like, oh yeah, I didn't not feel that way, but I also know that I might not feel that way in a year or 2 or 3. So that work is not finished in those moments where you contrast that with my own experience growing up in a Lutheran church. Loved it, had a great experience there. But it very much felt like, okay, you're through confirmation. Check that box, stand up in front of the congregation, make your proclamation of faith, and we are good to go.
Yeah. Just to me, it seems, I guess, as I'm processing that some too, I think with the idea of diversity, but also what you're just saying to, like, would it be safe to say, like, one takeaway from that would be, rather than creating a place where we're just telling them how to live and how to believe and how to, have faith and everything, to be creating safe places where they can feel comfortable exploring that together with people that can support them. Would that be a good takeaway from that?
Yeah, and I've been exposed to some language over the last couple of years that I think it really is useful here, which is safe people as opposed to safe places. I mean, they're just not going to see, because of the history of the church in this country has not been uniform by any stretch, and often institutions interacted really poorly towards entire groups of people. And that is a history that is well known to a lot of young people in the country. And so the idea of any church seeming like it's a safe space, no matter who's running it or what it's saying at that moment, is just really unlikely. But we can do that other work, that relational work of creating safe people to do exactly the thing that you just said, which is so critical for them, which is like, this is a safe relationship and a safe person with which to engage in these conversations, and to be, to ask whatever questions you need to be asked, and to get whatever insights that might be able to, be given.
That's cool. That's really good. I'm gonna think about that a little bit, because I think it's spot on. Because how can we create people and then even send them out to go to people and build those relationships, rather than just, I create a safe place at my youth ministry. Like, why aren't kids coming?
So it's safe.
It's safe. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's really good. So, you've shared so much good stuff, great wisdom, insights, and everything already. Are there any other tips or encouragements that you would like to share as we wrap up today with our audience of youth pastors that are listening?
I would say that they, just don't discount how much young people are interested in these questions. As I say it, they're on your team. Like 75% of young people describe themselves as religious or spiritual. That's the overwhelming, majority of them. Even though I know it can often feel in our social media feeds like, we are a completely secularized nation that doesn't believe in anything anymore. It's just not the case. That doesn't mean that it won't be the case if we don't do something about it. I mean, there are a lot of different versions of the future that could play out, and that's one of them. But right now, anyway, young people are telling us that they are interested in these questions and are very interested in what you have to say about it. So I would just encourage, religious leaders to engage, to find whatever ways that you can to authentically represent who you are and to demonstrate how much you care through those relationships with young people and in their lives. I think you'll find a good reception from them in that regard.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. And Josh, I know that our listeners are going to want to connect with you and Springtide more. They're going to want to read more, probably want to ask maybe some follow-up questions of their own. What are the best places for people to find you all online?
Oh, yeah, you bet. So we're at springtideresearch.org. You can find all of our stuff there on our website. And you can find us on social media at We Are Springtide, or I'm on Twitter at Dr. Josh Packard. You can, all my DMs are open, as they say. So you can feel free to ask me any questions there if you want. But, and know that coming up next year in 2022, Springtide's going to be helping organizations to understand the role that, the critical role that attending to a young person's faith and spiritual life has to play in their overall mental health. And so we'll be spending all of 2022 thinking about and sharing the research and what we've been learning about that model. So certainly you can come and get the State of Religion Young People from 2021 and stay, get on the mailing list, stay up to date with how that mental health research unfolds over the coming year.
Oh, wow. That's so good. I'm excited because I think that's something we really need to dig into, especially in mental health. Like that's,
absolutely.
I like long before any of this happened, when I was considering what my master's degree was going to be focused in, I kind of felt like I need to go into counseling and kind of dig into that mental health world a little bit. Little did I know that it was going to become such a big thing years later. And it's very valuable, and there's still so much to learn. So much more we could be doing, especially with young people. So cool.
For sure.
Well, thank you so much, Josh, for being on the podcast and sharing all this important research and insights with us. May God bless all that you do for us and as religious leaders and for young people.
Oh, thank you for saying that. Thank you for having me on.
And thank you all so much for being here for this episode of the Student Ministry Podcast. If you like what you hear, be sure to leave a positive review on your podcast app or service of choice. And be sure to share this with another youth worker who you think would enjoy and benefit from this episode. Again, if you'd like a free digital copy of The State of Religion and Young People, Navigating Uncertainty, you can head to the link in the show notes. But if you'd also like a chance to win a physical copy of that book for free, head to bit.ly/springtidebook, and that link will also be in our show notes, and also a link that you can purchase the book from Springtide as well. We also want to thank our sponsors once again, G-Shades at gshades.org. Be sure to use the promo code TSMPOD to save 10% off your order. And also MinHub at minhubsync.com/SMP. Once again, thank you so much for listening, and may God bless your ministry.